So as you know, the plenary session today is Carl Blyth from Texas, Austin, Texas, where they had a blizzard. And he couldn't get here for his plenary yesterday. And I guess he'll explain the quarter-inch why that's a blizzard.
Devastation.
Coming from the Northeast, it's amazing to me that they closed down the airport even before the snow arrived. Anyway, but we are really happy that he made it here and is going to be our plenary today. So he is the director of one of our sister language centers. Circle is a language resource center funded by the federal government. And he has one, I have to put on my glasses, I forgot to make it bigger. Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning, or CORAL, at UT Austin. His was created in this last funding round, so his is in the 4th year, we're in our 8th year. But we were really happy when his came in because we really have had a lot of back and forth with doing things together. It's been really nice to have him as a colleague at another center. That center, I don't know if you're going to talk about it, Carl, so I'll say something. The way it's said on the website is that it seeks to reframe foreign language education in terms of multilingualism, to be highly active in promoting open multimedia courseware for less commonly taught languages, open corpora based on sociolinguistic principles, such as varieties of Spanish, for students and educators, and innovative tools for language training and language learning. Carl's research includes computer-mediated discourse, corpus linguistics, CrossCultural and intercultural pragmatics, interactional sociolinguistics, and pedagogical grammar. He's published on metalinguistic awareness, native and non-native role models for language learning, with an emphasis on non-native, which has gotten him into trouble in times, including at his alma mater, where he went to give a talk and they kind of reacted badly because they felt you should only have native speakers as your role models. And we all know that debate, of course, in applied linguistics. Works on narrative discourse, pedagogical norms, and stance-taking and interaction, and open models for educational publishing. I think you see a theme here of open models and open source and so forth, and that, of course, has to do with his work for the Language Resource Center, which is dedicated to that. His address today will be on preparing language teachers to teach for intercultural competence, the promise of cultural linguistics. Please welcome Carl Blyth.
Thank you, Lynn, for that introduction, and thank you, Circle, for inviting me. And at lunch today, Alvino Fantini, where's Alvino? He asked me, do you have proof that you were actually stuck in Austin? So I do. I took pictures on my cell phone, and I just wanted to show you the magnitude of this natural disaster, that we're calling the blizzard of 2014. As Lynn said, I was stuck in the airport. They closed the airport even before a flake had hit the ground because they heard it was coming. So we were trapped in snow-filled forests. It was just horrible. Our homes were completely destroyed. Animals were forced to endure unimaginable hardships. Can you imagine trying to find a place to pee? Our winter harvests were frozen. And yet, the spirit of Austin prevailed. So I am here. Thank you very much. So as Lynn said in the introduction, that I'm going to be talking about intercultural and also the promise of cultural linguistics, and talking to you about language and culture as open systems. That is one of the threads that kind of, I think, pulls together many of my ideas and my research interests. But because I had an extra day, I went beyond cultural linguistics and added ethno-linguistics. It was a 3-hour flight to LA. And why not? And sociolinguistics. So we're going to do cultural linguistics, ethno-linguistics, and I have to talk fast. So my agenda is, first I'll start off problematizing linguistics for intercultural education, because there are many people who talk about intercultural education without emphasizing language. As a linguist, I want to talk about how I see the two overlapping somewhat, but it is a problem. And then the different kinds of linguistics that I've alluded to, so cultural, ethno-linguistics, and then sociolinguistics, and then talk about activities for understanding what I'm calling cultural meaning, and finally to end with becoming teachers of meaning, because I think that's really my focus. So part one, problematizing linguistics. I came, you know how you do, they ask you for an abstract a year in advance, and meanwhile I got this book which really helped me sort through some of these issues, that Linguistics for Intercultural Education in the series Language Learning and Language Teaching. And here's a quote, this is by Dervin and Liddycote. Seeing intercultural education as an activity which is fundamentally based in language means that there is a demonstrable capacity for linguistics to contribute to intercultural education. However, the role of linguistics itself needs to be problematized in such an endeavor. Understanding language as a complex, personalized, and contingent meaning-making system, and I would add to that list of adjectives an open system, right, for open to the outside, system has implications for conceptualizing what linguistics is as a contributor to intercultural education and where and how linguistics can be engaged. I totally agree with this, that statement. So let me tell this story. Lynn also introduced me as somebody interested in narrative analysis, which I learned from Lynn, actually. And I'd like to frame this in terms of my own narrative because, you know, as a talk, everything looks so neat. But this is what happened to me. This all started about 4 years ago when I was asked to teach linguistics for students of literature. This is a course on the books. It's required for our PhD students, or it used to be required for our PhD students in French studies. The linguists among ourselves talked about it as a service course, which meant it wasn't one of those that you wanted to teach. It's a survey course, so a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. You know, we give you a taste of just about everything, all the different subdisciplines. And we used to rationalize it. We told ourselves, well, it's good. It's going to help them. It'll help them improve, I don't know, the use of language tools like dictionaries. And we'll teach them a little bit about the phonetic alphabet. And that's got to be useful. And also, of course, they're literature people. We know that. But they may be in a department and they have to interact with these people called linguists. So it might help them socialize. So, OK, it was not a terribly well thought out course. And it was not a very imaginative course, and nobody wanted to teach it, including me, really. I thought we can do better. So in thinking about this course, I also thought about trying to bridge the disciplines. And we all know that within foreign language, there are multiple subdisciplines. This is a quote from a paper by Janet Swaffer. Foreign language study is a discipline with 4 subfields, language, literature, linguistics, and culture, that asks the question, how do individuals and groups use words and other sign systems in context to intend, negotiate, and create meanings? Within this definition, I'm not talking about linguistics alone. I'm suggesting that our profession must derive principles of foreign language study from the expanded social core of language in communities. And I took that kind of as my mission. I thought, that's right. That resonated with me, this notion of expanded social core of language in communities. And certainly, I think, it calls to mind intercultural approaches. I was also affected by the MLA report, the famous MLA report, 2007, that asked us to teach differences in meaning, mentality, and worldview as expressed in American English and the target language. So there started to be a pattern. I thought about this plenary as engaging with our keynote, and I looked at the abstract, and unfortunately I missed the talk. But the rise of this new kind of way of conceptualizing what language is, and we see that there are recurrent adjectives used, that meaning is contingent, it's emergent, it's complex, it's situated, dynamic, it's provisional, it's a verb, it's not a noun. So here's the problem then. linguistic approaches to meaning don't really match up very well with those adjectives, because in traditional forms of much of linguistics, form or structure is privileged over meaning, and conventionalized meaning is often privileged over situated meaning or novel meanings, meanings that arise on the moment. Meaning is often studied in a very decontextualized fashion, and finally, all these problems derive from this idea of looking at language as an autonomous system, which is very problematic for language teachers trying to, of course, put language and culture together. So this is a quote from Cliff Goddard, who has a book on semantics, and he says, if language can be seen as a system for connecting sounds with meanings or forms with meanings, then as Wallace Chafe once observed, and Chafe is a well-known linguist, once observed, the typical linguistics curriculum seems curiously lopsided. A proper concern for meanings should lead to a situation where, in the training of linguists, or teachers, I would say, practice in the discrimination of concepts will be given at least as much time in the curriculum as practice in the discrimination of sounds. So I thought, that's a really interesting idea. We need to give our teachers more practice with meaning. So my challenge, as I saw it, was, one, to take this new view of language as more dynamic and emergent, again, the view that was articulated in the keynote, and put that together with this notion of practicing in the discrimination of concepts or meaning. So my solution was to focus on meaning-focused linguistics, and that's where I think all three of these different types of linguistics have something in common. So what are these different types of linguistics? Well, real quickly, cultural linguistics is a brand of linguistics that combines cognitive linguistics and cognitive anthropology, which simply means that it borrows a lot of heuristics from cognitive science, things like conceptualizations and cultural models and scripts and schemata. So essentially, it's looking at language and culture as group cognition. That's the important point there, or shared understandings. And the names of the field are Gary Palmer, Farzad Sharifian, James Underhill, among others. These were two books that were actually important for me as I was kind of trying to figure out how to frame this course and put it together. The book on the right there, Toward a Theory of Cultural Linguistics, gave a nice overview of this field. And then in 2007, there appeared Applied Cultural Linguistics, because now they're starting to venture into the domain of foreign language teaching and intercultural communication. There was an article in that in the Yellow Book, Applied Cultural Linguistics, written by Anna Wierzbicka, excuse my Polish, Wierzbicka, and Cliff Goddard. And they were talking about cultural scripts, which is really about ethno-linguistics. And the main difference between ethno-linguistics and cultural linguistics, it also goes by the name of cross-cultural pragmatics, is really the shift to the insider's perspective, because all those fancy cognitive heuristics, conceptualizations, frames, whatever, may not be the words, the structures that the insider would use to describe his or her own language. So they've proposed this notion of just using natural language to describe the phenomena, okay? And here are a couple of books, Ethnopragmatics by Cliff Goddard and Ethnolinguistics and Cultural Concepts. And finally, I want to add then to this list Sociolinguistics. And here, this is a big field. I'm only really focusing on the notion of indexicality, which I performed at lunch. So let me give you an example. So this is essentially the notion of social meaning, or how we use language to index or create persona. So creaky voice, it's a phenomenon, so creaky voice. Or it's also called vocal fry. Sociolinguists have become very interested in this because in American English, 18, 19, 20-year-old women seem to be, for some reason, becoming creakier. But the real idea then is, well, okay, but what does that mean? Because language has a tendency to pick up social meaning. And these are talked about in terms of variables in sociolinguistics, so you can say it without or with creaky voice. So when you're talking like that, what kind of indexical meaning or social meaning do you attach to that? And this has a lot to do with stance, as we're going to find out. And the names here are Scott Kiesling, Penny Eckert, and Barbara Johnstone, so sociolinguists who are looking at things like stance. And this is one of the books that was important to me. Okay, so now let me move to my activities. I wanted to put all these kinds of things together. But language teachers are about practices. We have to turn the theory into some practice, and that required some activities. So cultural models. Many of you know about this website, Cultura, or Cultura, and it is a well-known telecollaborative project that started at MIT more than a decade ago. It's been greatly criticized, actually, in intercultural approaches because people have said that it leads to a culturalist discourse. It reifies or makes culture too static. And for example, what the main design principle here is juxtaposition. You give students, and remember, on the left we have the American responses, and on the right we have the French responses. So essentially we're talking about two classes that are paired together on the internet, a class in France and a class in the United States. For this task, and they have many different kinds of production tasks, they say, name what are three lexical associations you have with this word? Individualism, individualisme. Okay, and so what you get is essentially a small data set, right? So I thought actually, and I've taught with these materials many different times, and I think there is some problems with Cultura. I absolutely love it, but I think we need to be careful with it because I think the idea of turning culture into lists like this can be very problematic. So I turned to cognitive anthropology because anthropologists do not want to essentialize culture. They want to show a nuanced understanding of it. And this is a great book called Finding Culture in Talk, a collection of methods. So I thought if I could use their methods and turn those into pedagogical methods, maybe I'm onto something. So I tweaked Cultura, and I talked to my students. I framed each one of these tasks as a cognitive task because cognition is itself a process. So I got to talk about these creation of these lists as a cognitive process. So we could change the data by changing, for example, the stimulus or the question. I added a lot more data because I thought just a small sample often leads to main effects or stereotypes, so they're much more nuanced than what you can see. And I talked a lot about the concept of construal, or taking a perspective in language. And finally, one of the criticisms of this kind of approach, this cross-cultural or contrastive approach, has been that it emphasizes differences and not just the similarities. It's the overlap, too, that's important. So I borrowed a bunch of techniques from that book. First of all, AntConc is a concordance program. It's freeware, so you can download it in for PC version, Mac version, Linux version. And really, you don't have to be a corpus linguist. You can just count, and it does lexical frequencies. So I basically gave them 8 years of data, and then they put it into this program, and we got then the most frequent words. And I took then also, in this morning's talk, Tony mentioned Wordle.com to create word clouds, which are really easy to do. You just dump a text in, and boom, it becomes a word cloud for you. And finally, the last two I think were really important for avoiding essentialism. Roy D'Andrade is a cognitive anthropologist who talks about just propositions. So taking the most frequent words and then turning them into propositions. In other words, putting the most frequent words in parts of speech and then taking those and turning them into propositions. I'll show you what I mean by that. And finally, a cultural standing. Once you have a model, the most important point that is not done in Cultura is to determine how shared the model is. So here we have the data sorted in a word cloud. And I'm just going to show you real quickly. Here's the French. Here's the English. Here's the French. Here's the English. And you see a pattern, right? Even if you can't read the words if you're far in the back and you don't have your glasses on, the main point you can get from the structure is that the cultural model coming from the data, this is not French, or this is not American, this is just the cultural model based on the data, has several different elements that stand out. So it's more diffuse than the French model, which is overwhelmingly focalized on one semantic element. That's an important takeaway. From there, you can do something called just propositions. So you take these words and turn them into propositions. So individualism, based on the American data, is the free expression of the self's uniqueness. Individualism is beneficial to the self in excess because the Americans were not all positive. The stereotype says it's always positive for Americans, it's always negative for the French. That's not true. The Americans did recognize that it could be problematic for the self. But notice something that's missing. In the American data, it was the self, the self, the self, the self. There's something missing that's very important for the French. Individualism based on the French data is the selfish act of thinking of oneself without reference to the group. In the French mind, it was totally relational. So the result of individualism is an unhealthy separation of the person from the group, and separating oneself from the group is harmful for the person as well as the group. Now, this is translated from the French data. And finally, another important step is cultural standing continuum. Once we've got these models that come from data, how shared are they? And that's very important. So what we can see here, now what I'm trying to represent here is on the far right, is that's taken for granted. Every member of society shares this belief. That's doxa. So, for example, the sun, these are kind of eternal truths. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, right? Okay, so it would be very odd to say, I think the sun sets in the west. That's odd. So the point being that for eternal verities, you frame them as eternal verities. They're linguistic patterns. Whereas on the other end of the scale, this is a belief that one individual, it's very idiosyncratic, says, but nobody else seems to agree. So there you're going to get, I think that. Okay, so that's one cultural model, and I wanted to, one activity, and relate these to different kinds of activities, so the ethnopragmatics of stance. Because Cultura looks a lot at the data, but I felt one of the things, it's hard to turn the students back on the actual interaction. So stance here, and it goes by the word stance or stance taking. Again, this split between the noun and the kind of static notion and the more progressive or a dynamic notion. So stance is usually a pattern found in aggregated data. So a lot of corpus linguists talk about it in terms of stance. So British stance, American stance. Stance taking, as I said, is the term used in interactional studies, dynamic patterns of alignment. So one of the best definitions of stance that people are now citing all the time comes from John Dubois' work. And he says, he describes it as a public act by a social actor achieved dialogically through overt communicative means of simultaneously evaluating objects, positioning subjects, and aligning with other subjects with respect to any salient dimension of the sociocultural field. Thank goodness he gives us a triangle, seeing that's, what do you mean? Okay, so up here we have subject one, which could have been an American student who makes a comment about individualism. And it's responded by another subject, subject two, a French person, let's say. But the point is that they're evaluating, they're making an opinion, and by the act of evaluation, they position themselves vis-a-vis each other. So saying an opinion has social consequences, is basically what he's saying. And people who study stance talk about it in terms of actually three dimensions. Epistemic stance, so how certain a speaker is about the utterance. Affective stance, how a speaker represents her feelings or moods. And of course, as I said, it has social consequences, so the interpersonal dimension, how a speaker presents the relationship with the interlocutor. And actually, these three stances then all travel together. As Kiesling says, someone who's being patronizing, it's an impersonal stance, is usually expressing that they're also very certain, an epistemic stance, about what they're saying, but they're also expressing something about that knowledge with respect to their interlocutor. Okay. So going back to what I said earlier about indexicalization, these social meanings, people interpret your stances and they assign meanings to them. My American students oftentimes would say they're so arrogant in talking about the French, and I said, and what part of language, why are you saying that? This is, of course, a social judgment. What triggered that association? They're not discussing, they're debating. Ils font la classe de philo. This was actually said by a French linguist, a friend of mine, who was looking at the data, and he just said, well, I know what they're doing. They're doing philosophy class. That's how we were trained. These are statements then about the interpretations about the actual interaction. So let me jump to what I did with this. Our class just looked, and I ended up publishing this data. There are many elements that go into stance taking, but we looked at just one, which is reference, how you refer to others or yourself. So just looking at one dimension, one part of language is telling first person subject pronouns in the English data and in the French data, and they were hugely different. The Americans used 3 times more reference to themselves in constructing their opinions in this interaction, and that had huge consequences for them, the dynamics of the interaction. Okay, activity 3. As I said, my students were from primarily literary studies, and so I wanted to have an activity that talked about the process of interpretation with using literary text. And this is a textbook that we were using for our 4th semester, and I knew something about it because I was one of the co-authors, and we were choosing a text in particular, and I put the text in this program called eComma. And eComma is an open source tool that we've been developing at Coral for something that we're calling social reading. It's open, it's free, you can use it. It's been launched this summer and different people are using it. So let me give you just a little bit about a real quick tour of what I mean by social reading. So on the left, you have the text, and actually this is Jabberwocky, right? So I was doing a presentation last summer with teachers, and the whole point is you can drag and annotate. You're doing basically collaborative markup. So the metaphor, I think, is to think of a text as a meeting place. People can come and meet inside the text and then have a conversation. And we see up here that up at the top, let me walk over here. Okay, so Beamish, the person has highlighted Beamish, and he's asking the question to the group, is this a positive or negative adjective, right? Come to my arms, my Beamish boy. And somebody responds in Hebrew. I don't know if anybody reads Hebrew here, which is responded to in Japanese. So the point that I'm trying to show you is it can be multilingual. And then the third person responds with multimodality, so you can gloss words with, of course, images. I actually used this, and the first time I used this was to teach a French surrealist poem, and my students, I had not anticipated it, but they went through and glossed with surrealist paintings. So I thought that was a great idea. But in addition to then the back and forth of glossing and commenting with each other, you can also, there are built-in tools such as, here we have a reading that is, this looks like French, but it's not French. Mote élevé ici en dedans la paroisse Saint-Martin, au roi le baïtèche. So we have Louisiana Creole. And I gave this to some graduate students to look at variation in the text. And of course, this is really great for using word clouds, which it's automatically generated because you can sort the text in many different ways. So the point is, they're in this space, and I had our teachers watch what happened. They were basically lurking. It's like lurking in a chat room. And we gave them this text, La Grève des Bateaux, which is a Senegalese text, a Francophone text, by Animata Fall. And the whole point of this text really turns around this discrepancy or this frame-breaking notion of cultural striking beggars. How can a beggar possibly go on strike? Well, we were aware of this, and we made sure that we had a pre-reading activity where we talked about Senegal. Where is it in the world? It's an Islamic society. You should know that. What are the 5 pillars of Islam, including almsgiving? Hint, hint. So we tried to lead them in that direction for them to understand the text. But the night before, I asked the students, okay, I want you to anticipate what the kinds of problems are going to be in interpretation. Again, a kind of a teacher activity to have them think about this as if real live students were going to do this text. And to help them, I thought I broke it down into this notion of reading the lines or decoding, reading between the lines or inferencing or discussion about causality, and then the cultural frame, reading beyond the lines. And we found some interesting things. The majority of the annotations were, as the student teachers thought, they were focused on decoding. What is the word? What is the tense? And so forth. But we found out that the pre-reading activities were completely insufficient for evoking the cultural frame. They kept coming back to this again and again. I don't get it. This doesn't make any sense. How can a beggar go on strike? One thing I want to say about the social reading notion is that it was highly computer-mediated activity. So they had Google open, they had Maps open, they were using many other resources just besides just besides the text and the glosses that I had given them. So this is an idea to look at cultural meaning embedded in text. And we just published an OER, an open educational resource at Coral, called The Literary in the Everyday, Le littéraire dans le quotidien. And it is produced, we've been testing a lot of this tool, ICAMA, at Cornell. And they have a terrific French instructor, a lecturer in French called Joanna Lux, and she's really quite adept at making literacy activities that's nicely scaffold the whole process of social reading. And she also embeds then within these activities and these texts how to use these tools, these various computer tools. Finally, my last activity, Rich Points. I'm sure many of you know the book called Language Shock, Understanding the Culture of Conversation by Michael Agar, published in '94. And he is an ethnographer, an ethnography of speaking. And his notion of rich point, I think, has been taken over in intercultural studies, but it means a departure from an outsider's perspective that signals a difference between lingua cultures, is his term. So essentially, anytime you're in an interaction with a cultural other and something seems confusing, or something seems awry, or something seems out of sync, that's a rich point. And in his book, essentially, it's lots of his own personal rich points. He recounts these as narratives. So I started collecting a while ago rich points. And of course, study abroad is a wonderful place to do this. Whenever somebody has a problem with their host family, I say, would you write that down for me, please? Okay? So I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this was a really interesting event, a rich point between one of our students who turned out to be a Truman Scholar. So she's perhaps one of the best undergraduate students at the University of Texas, and I placed her with this father because she likes to argue and she's not going to back down, and the father likes to argue too. So, and she also had the linguistic chops. She was good in French, so she could really get in there and talk about politics and religion and not back down. But anyhow, she talks about, basically last night at dinner, I brought up the subject of individualism. Of course, we were talking about it in my class. I used a direct translation, individualisme, so you can already see there are problems here. But I won't tell you the whole story. What she says is my host, in red, my host father quite angrily responded, and later on, it was like talking to a brick wall. It was obvious he would not budge. She talks a lot about his affect and she interprets it, and there's a very rich indexical ground. She's interpreting his linguistic moves and she is judging them. She's assigning social meaning to them. He's arrogant or he's mean, he's a meanie. Okay, and I seem to get annoyed. So rich points are great for getting into the cognitive process of interpretation, and also getting at something that's not easy, and that, of course, is the affective component. So let me sum up. What I really discovered, what I was trying to do in this course, was talk about lingua culture. And by lingua culture, I mean training teachers, and these were PhD students, and all of them were already teaching in our program, so they saw themselves as language teachers, even though they had pedagogical formation in literature or in media studies. And the whole point, of course, is to talk about how culture is embedded within linguistic structure at all the languages. So I turned the course into basically a course on lingua culture, or what I'm saying, cultural meaning. So what I'd like to end up by saying is that there's a lot of talk about the intercultural and its relation to the cross-cultural. So what was I doing? Well, I was trying to do both, actually. And so in the keynote, where we have this new vision that I quite support of what language and culture is as open, adaptive, dynamic systems, I also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. and that baby is cross-cultural approaches, because they do very different things. I think it's important for us to look at the process of interaction, but always people bring a lot of cultural baggage with them, the a priori, that bring with them into the interaction. So language and culture can always be looked at as process and product. It can be looked at as individual behavior, which typically goes more in the domain of intercultural, but because we call it cultural, it has to also be group. Otherwise, it's not truly cultural. It also, and I was trying to show you quickly, kind of a mixed methods approach, because qualitative research, of course, is going to go hand in hand with pragmatic research and discourse analysis. Quantitative research, I was showing you whenever you kind of have big number sets, you just have to count something. You don't have to run statistics, but you can count. So language and culture, they're both verbs and they're both nouns. And this, there's a concept in linguistics, antinomy, which is an apparent contradiction between equally valid principles. So you can teach linguistics, we've been doing it for hundreds of years, synchronically or diachronically. It's always language, it's just looked at from a different time scale or a different perspective. So let me give the last word here to Claire Crampsch, somebody who knows a lot about teaching language and culture, and now teaching language as culture. And when the MLA report came out and they were trying to articulate this new vision of what language and culture was, there was, not surprisingly, a backlash, a misinterpretation. People said, what, you don't want us to teach grammar? So she published a series of articles trying to explain the notion of translingual, transcultural competence, and we're still doing that. But here's a good quote. She said, of course language teachers must continue to teach the structures of one symbolic system and ensure that their students master those structures. But the committee, the MLA committee, of which she was a member and she was one of the authors, we wanted to go beyond structure. It saw language teachers as teachers of meaning, social, cultural, historical, and aesthetic meaning. And I think, okay, I think, Claire, that's what I was trying to do with this new course, is to cross all of those bridges and put them together. And I see then lingua culture as, I think, an effective way to go, to conceptualize this intersection. So all good narratives have to have a coda. At least that's what Labov teaches us. And that brings the whole point is to, okay, that's the story world. Let's come back to today. So what about this course and what about your students? Well, the evaluations were good, I'm happy to say. They said something that they had never said in the history of this course, and that was that it was relevant. So they could actually do something with this course and they could apply it to their literary analyses. And very meaningful and very important for me, they could apply it to their language teaching. So that was very important to me. But the course no longer exists. It got canceled. Why is that? Well, because the dean was telling us that we needed to get our students through the pipeline faster, our PhDs, from beginning to end. And we were looking for ways basically to streamline the program, to make it more efficient. And of course, there is this discourse of interdisciplinarity on the one hand, but when push came to shove, we kind of dropped that interdisciplinarity. And so today, unfortunately, even though I was trying to bridge those boundaries or bridge those disciplines, it actually is more separated. We have linguistics over here and we have literature over here, which is just too bad. So let me end with, I started with a little bit of snow. This is the real polar vortex. I was in Chicago a couple weeks ago and it was really cold there. And I just like this. I don't know, I just like this. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. So if you have any question, just raise your hand and then you will point.
Any questions about lingua culture?
Carl, can I ask?
Yes.
You use lingua culture and then you use you use lingua culture and then you use lingua culture.
Variation. Right.
Is it just variation or do you see a difference?
Well, that's a good question. I have started using lingua culture because I think it's more and more people are referring to it as lingua culture. I haven't sussed it out to know exactly if Agar is using it quite differently than Friedrich or all these other people who are using it. I'm particularly, I like lingua culture because it was Paul Friedrich who actually, he was an anthropological linguist who coined the term, and he was also talking not only about like the pragmatics and the semantics, but poetic indeterminacy. So that's a very important point. He was also talking about meaning of all kinds, so the social, sociolinguistic meaning, the poetic, aesthetic meaning, and then what we often talk about is pragmatic meaning. So I'm just partial to that. And I should also say Karen Riesiger, who is a Danish sociolinguist, is publishing now on culture and language pedagogy. She uses lingua culture at the term. Yeah. So I think that's the one that's prevailing. But you know, it's language, so it could change. I actually have questions for you, but yes?
I really enjoyed the talk. I have a question. You did mention the difference between cross-cultural and intercultural, and we're here at a conference that has in its title the word intercultural.
Mm-hmm.
But several times you also mentioned the term transcultural, and I do remember in the MI 2007 report it used transcultural almost consistently. I have been wondering ever since I saw that report, even to this day, what exactly is the difference between intercultural and transcultural? I think it might be...
Where is Claire Crouch when we need her? I don't have a lot of background in transcultural, the movement between. I think it's another way of framing what we're talking about, so taking a perspective. So whether you're going to one place, the intercultural third space, or moving back and forth over time between two, this notion of transnational instead of getting out of the static framework of one nation, but actually this whole notion of movement is, I think, at the center of transnational or translingual transculturalism. The cross-cultural, as I was saying, often is taken as this activity where you are supposed to construct two rather static notions of this is culture one and this is culture two, and then to try to find the differences. And of course, that's what I was saying has been criticized by people who are saying that's problematic, because actually when people start to talk, all hell breaks loose, and they may move to different kinds of positions. So I actually think that all three are really important. They're trying to name, I think, slightly different phenomena, but the phenomena are all related, which is what I was trying to get at. So they're different perspectives on what's happening. Yes.
Right. So in an age when interdisciplinarity has become a mantra, the University of Arizona has, is very committed to this whole idea of interdisciplinarity, and at least they talk a lot about it, and they put it in strategic plans and things like that. SLAD is obviously committed to the whole idea of interdisciplinarity. I wonder how UT Austin can get away with, essentially going against the current, because interdisciplinarity is the byword of all universities today.
I don't mean to say that UT Austin. I was speaking. This is a narrative, so let's stay with the particular. This was one course. They're certainly in, and it was then we decided to not continue the course for some very specific reasons. Yeah, I would say that the point I was raising is that we have the discourse of interdisciplinarity, and everybody thinks it's a great thing to do, but we still remain in our silos, we still remain in departments, we still remain in our subdisciplines, and so it's just hard to do. It's hard to do because of the structures of universities that still conceptualize fields as unique. So, I mean, we even have problems at our institution of having things like team teaching, because the question is who's going to take the points. I mean, so it comes down to the whole. It's hard to collaborate in certain environments, and there are a lot. When you start to look at it, a lot of our practices, our academic practices, I think, kind of efface collaboration. Carl Blyth et al. Well, who are those other people? We have a lot of things that I think denigrate collaboration, and then that collaboration to me is at the heart of interdisciplinarity. So there was a question, yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Wonderful talk. I have a question on the practical side, I guess, and on practicing and teaching lingua culture, that interface. And so one question I have is, how successful have you been with your Ridgepoint collection? I have started one too, and not only, I'm sure it's very successful with the students when they start bringing it up and you use it in class. I'm thinking with teachers too, because I think one thing we need to do is start talking about lingua culture as teachers first, before maybe we can, or parallel to teaching it. And then my other question related to that is, how is that the idea of collecting rich points in order to get into this construal and this concept of lingua culture is related to Kern's proposal of the foundational stories of major cultural groups and then subcultures too. It seems like two
Right.
practical entries into.
Okay, well, let me tell you then my dream. I'd like to create like a corpus of rich point stories, because then you can start to do the kind of analyses that you're talking about. One of the things, and you start to play with them, because since we're talking about turning this into an activity and practices, I showed you one story, but actually there are two stories because this was a two-sided argument. And I went back and I asked the father, the host father, if he would tell his rich point story, and he wrote it out too. And that's when it became really enlightening to have both of the same events. I mean, that's the whole point of a narrative that gets filtered through somebody's subjectivity. And what a surprise, it comes out quite different. So that's just one element of tweaking the rich point. But yeah, I actually found that it was easy to elicit if the circumstances are right. So I was doing this at a study abroad course that had a heavy ethnographic element. So I was constantly turning it back on their interactions with their families and saying, what happened, document it. So it was actually, I folded right into the course, so they had to do it. But after they started understanding it, they were able to collect their own rich points, and they started sharing them in classes and comparing them. Yeah, so I mean, basically what I would say is there are some areas in the field that lend themselves to gathering rich points. So that's one of the areas where I'd like to tell people, let's talk about this and say how we can gather this data together and, you know, start to compile it in an archive or something.
Thank you so much. Just a follow-up question to the one about rich points. You know, I think that's really interesting from the perspective of an analyst, and it sounds like you embedded it into a course. Could you talk a little bit more about how that was turned to the students in terms of reflection and their own learning from the experiences of sharing their narratives?
Yeah, I kind of set it up. First of all, rich points, like any narrative, elicits other narratives. So when somebody starts to share in the classroom about something that happened, that you just need to get the ball rolling, and that's what happened. I was framing it in terms of social meaning and these different areas of stance taking. So I was guiding them by giving them some kind of a rubric and having them go through the interaction and think about it that way. So instead of, I've given it to people and say, you know, what do you think happens? And again, you need to scaffold, like any teacher knows, you need to scaffold the activity and lead them down the garden path to a certain point, because otherwise they stay at a kind of a superficial level. But yeah, at this point I was trying to highlight then the affective, what's affective. And since this is an actual narrative, I also treat it as narration. So how do they narrate this? And that, of course, is narratives are constructed by narrators, and that's the other piece that I wanted them to understand. So basically, another thing I had them do is go through and highlight what's called evaluation. Anything that's a judgment or evaluative, because again, according to Lebovian's sociolinguistics, that's the point of the narrative. That's why they're telling you these events, is from their perspective.
First of all, thank you. This is an excellent talk. I had a question about when we're doing the analysis of the first person pronoun and epistemic stance. You were saying that these were positions of belief being expressed, and in English it was a lot of 133 uses of I versus 33 in French, absent. But if it were epistemic and belief system, my question was, how do you distinguish them? If I have an entire series of statements of belief where someone is saying, this is how it is, I'm not saying I.
Yeah. So
saying, this is how it is, versus the other side saying, I believe, I think.
You're right. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get my students to think about, like those kinds of questions that you're asking. How are these kinds of meanings embedded in linguistic structure? So you're absolutely right. Not every single one of these examples of I statements or je statements are je pense, je crois, I think, I believe. No, they're often I feel. And so what we did was classify all of those. So not all of them are epistemic statements at all, right? So, but just showing you that kind of raw data, many of the I statements were epistemic, yeah. So that's an important nuance. Thank you for raising that. And by the way, so Americans would say, I feel, and then they would make a statement like, I feel that this is not a good idea, or I feel that in my country, da-da-da, which you can actually say, you could say, I think, right? Those are fairly interchangeable, it turns out, but you can't really do that in French at all. So those are the kinds of nuances that I was trying to draw to their attention to.
Since we don't have any more questions, I think we can now close by thanking our speaker.
Thank you.